Hi, I'm hoping you enjoyed part one of the sturgeon portion of the Michigan Fisheries Education Initiative. Part two is going to focus on the work that's being done locally right here in the Detroit River and St. Clair River area, the Huron-Erie corridor, to build artificial spawning reefs for this magnificent species. Part two of our program will explore the actions that are currently being taken locally to bring back this giant lake sturgeon. We'll take a look at how sturgeon spawning reefs are actually created and see how they are monitored to determine if lake sturgeon and or other fish are actually using them. Let's revisit the sturgeon's life cycle. Think about what the sturgeon's needs might be as it moves through these different stages. Might its food change? Would its habitat change? Sure they would. When they are young and small, they'll need places to hide and rest. They'll always need places for food. And as adults, it's really important that they have places to lay their eggs. What would happen to a species if it was unable to successfully reproduce? So in the case of the sturgeon, if it couldn't find an appropriate place to lay eggs, could that species survive? Nearly 20 years ago, some professionals in the area got together and thought that maybe artificial spawning reefs could be created for sturgeon and other native fish in the St. Clair and Detroit River area, where spawning reefs used to exist but have been destroyed for shipping channels and other things like that. So sounds like a great idea, but this is a pretty big project. So how might something like this begin? Let's take a look at the process. So the goal is creating and restoring spawning reefs for lake sturgeon. So what should scientists need to know beforehand? A good place to start is determining where lake sturgeon have spawned before. They also need to know river conditions so they can match them with the conditions that sturgeon prefer for spawning. They would need to measure and determine things like water temperature, water depth, velocity of the water, and the bottom substrate in certain locations. So what conditions would a lake sturgeon look for when it's time to spawn and lay eggs? And in the Detroit River area, they like deep water, so 25 to 50 feet, because that is where the velocity is high enough, at least 0.5 meters per second of water flow. A high water velocity like this will keep the bottom substrate free of vegetation, and that water flow will continuously provide oxygen to the eggs. This image here on the right is showing a lake sturgeon on a spawning bed. Notice that there's no vegetation on that substrate. Scientists use mapping technology to determine appropriate locations for a potential sturgeon spawning reef. If the depth and water velocity are right, and it is not right in a shipping channel, they may have a potential site for creating a spawning reef. Scientists need to balance several factors when choosing a potential site. They must consider not only the physical and habitat aspects of a river, but also human use in the area, such as shipping and waterfront living. A successful project should not have a negative impact on other aspects of the river. So what is a spawning reef actually made of? After trying out several types and sizes of substrate to build the earliest reefs, scientists found that quarried limestone chunks about 4 to 8 inches in diameter make the best sturgeon spawning reefs. For a couple of reasons. Let's take a look. So this is an example of the actual type of limestone size and everything that would be used to build the sturgeon spawning reefs. It's the optimal size. So if we put a ruler in front of it here, it measures to be about 9 inches in length, which is the proper size to allow the right kind of space between the rocks to hide the eggs, and also it's the size that would keep invasive species like sea lamprey and round goby from using the spawning reefs, because we don't want to be creating spawning habitat for invasive species while we're creating spawning habitat for sturgeon. So this allows sturgeon to use them and other native species, but eliminates invasive species using the reefs. The reefs have been built with a couple of different methods. One is with a clamshell bucket and crane that's shown here, that is mounted on a barge that's over the reef location in the river, or from a dump barge shown here, where substrate is just dumped and then smoothed over on the bottom using a steel beam. So what actually goes on down there once a reef is created? This diagram shows a few species of fish using the bed for spawning, such as the walleye, lake sturgeon, and lake whitefish. And it also shows you the size of the reef. This one is 120 feet long, two and a half feet wide, 1.5 feet thick, under a water depth of about 30 feet. Notice the direction that the current is flowing. This image shows each spawning reef that has been created in the Huron-Erie corridor, which is the area between Lakes Huron and Erie. Each arrow points to a reef location. See that there are 4 in the Detroit River, and there are 3 in the St. Clair River. So after all this work, do we just leave the reefs and hope for the best? Not exactly. Monitoring and research is required to determine if reefs have successfully provided spawning habitat for sturgeon and other species. Let's take a look at a few ways that scientists monitor the reefs. One way that scientists monitor spawning reefs is to survey for adult fish species that are present on the spawning reef during the spawning season. Scientists would want to determine how many adult fish are using the reef and what species they are. This image here shows employees with the Fish and Wildlife Service pulling in a sturgeon during a survey. Let's take a look at just how they catch a sturgeon. So this is an example here of some of the equipment that would be used to sample and survey for adult sturgeon that might be using a spawning reef. So this here is called a set line, and biologists would set this out overnight and bait it with small fish and bring it up the next day to see who or what is on the hooks. So you'll see the set lines in the video with a couple of sturgeon on them, and then biologists will net the fish to actually pull them into the boat. So like I said, they would put a small bait fish on there, and it's just covered with electrical tape to protect our fingers for now. And of course, an actual set line used would be longer than this one. This is just a short cutoff version to use for education. So here let's look at some of the other tools that are used to track and monitor individual sturgeon. And you'll see some of these in the video and discussed in the video. This right here, this tiny little piece, that's an internal tag called a pit tag that would have all the information about the individual fish that could be pulled up later if that fish is caught again. And you'll see them waving a pit tag scanner like this over the fish in the video to check and see if it already has a pit tag inside of it. This here is an external tag that's clipped onto the tail of the fish, and you'll see that there's actually a phone number on here So if somebody is fishing and they bring in one of these sturgeon, they would call this phone number to report that fish. And I'm gonna flip it over here real quick, and you'll see that there is a number here that identifies that fish.
Welcome aboard the RV Channel Cat as we embark on our annual sturgeon setline survey in the North Channel of the St. Clair River. The lake sturgeon is the largest and longest lived Great Lakes fish species. They can live over 100 years and exceed 100 pounds. The population present in the St. Clair-Detroit River system is the largest in the Great Lakes and supports an increasingly popular recreational fishery. Our job is to monitor lake sturgeon populations, ensure their continued recovery, while learning more about their basic ecology. We sample lake sturgeon using set lines lifted by hand. Each lift is exciting because you never know what you will catch. Once on board, each fish is weighed, measured for total length, and given a thorough examination. Large fish are given an external tag for anglers to report, and all fish receive a pit tag so that recaptures can be easily identified. Teamwork ensures that fish are processed quickly, safely, and that all data collected is accurate. Finally, the fish is returned to the water and swims off until hopefully we see it again a few years down the road. Thank you for joining our team on board the RV Channel Cat. Together with our many partners, we're working to provide the science needed for the sound management of this iconic Great Lakes species. We hope to see you on the water.
Finding adult fish on the reefs during breeding season is one thing, but finding eggs in the reef is an even better confirmation that fish are spawning on the reef. How do you think scientists actually get these eggs from the reef? The image on the left shows scientists with the U.S. Geological Survey picking fish eggs off of mats. These mats are made of furnace filter wrapped around a metal frame, and they're laid over the spawning reef. At appropriate times, the mats were brought up, fish eggs were picked off, counted, and brought back to their lab for incubation and then identification once the larvae hatched from the eggs. Scientists also conduct surveys of larval or baby fish that would be downstream from a spawning reef. Remember that after sturgeon eggs hatch, the larvae drift downstream to wetland habitat that has good food and shelter for the small fish. The image here shows a student from the University of Michigan studying larval fish populations downstream from a spawning reef. For a reef project to really be successful, fish need to survive after they hatch, right? Here's an image of a newly hatched larval lake sturgeon. You can see the tiny barbels and suction mouth that give this away as a sturgeon. Hopefully by this point, you're just dying to know how the reef projects have gone and if they were successful. This chart summarizes the results from surveys. The columns are labeled with the name of each reef project, underlined here in red. The rows are labeled on the left with information for each reef. The bottom rows show before and after results for each reef. Every reef, aside from the Hart's Light Reef, had no sturgeon spawning activity before restoration. But currently, each reef does have spawning sturgeon activity. For the Grassy Island and Belle Isle reefs, spawning was confirmed after the creation of this chart. So you see the added text, spawning confirmed in 2016. So, has the restoration been successful? So yes, sturgeon restoration has been successful. It is not a completed project as reefs will need tending and surveying moving forward, but results show that sturgeon are benefiting greatly from these reefs. Let's take a look at what actually goes on a spawning reef when sturgeon are there. The following video was taken from a reef in the St. Clair River. It's a little long, almost 4 minutes, but a neat thing to watch. you will see towards the end that a couple sturgeon actually have sea lamprey attached to them. Recall that we talked about the invasive sea lamprey in phase 1 of your program. It was the parasitic fish that attaches to the side of fish bodies with inward curling teeth. It kind of looked like an eel. Finally, the last scene of the video shows one of the divers holding sturgeon eggs. I wanted to share this list of organizations with you to show that it takes a great amount of effort, collaboration, and cooperation by many partners and agencies to complete a project like this. This is a list of the organizations that worked on the restoration. That list is on the left, and also the important partners who funded their work, and that list is on the right. Hey, you stuck with me all the way to the end. Thanks again for being a part of this program. I hope that you've found this information about the lake sturgeon to be valuable and relevant to you and your community. as the lake sturgeon definitely is a part of our heritage here in the Detroit River and in the Great Lakes region. So, for the last part of your program, I've put together some activities that give you an opportunity to dig a little bit deeper and interact with some of the data that scientists have gathered about these reefs. And so this is real data that you'd be looking at. It's not something that I made up. It's data that scientists have gathered in the last few years. And not every question necessarily has a right or wrong answer, you'll notice. Some of them might be more opinion based. Now that you have some background knowledge about sturgeon, you might have an opportunity to do a little bit of critical thinking given that new information that you have. So thanks again for being a part of this program, and I do hope to see you guys at the Outdoor Adventure Center sometime soon. Thanks.